I would say that it's probably not likely that the Fed will cut rates here in this January decision. Good afternoon. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, I sure hope you're enjoying this sunshine here lately. We do have a bit of a shorter week in trading this week with the holiday on Monday, but nonetheless, we have a lot to cover with leading market indicators and all of this kind of ahead of the Fed decision coming up here next week. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, the data, the trends that we're watching, and hopefully weed out a bit of the noise along the way. And before I get to some of the more important data points I want to cover around leading economic indicators, I did want to touch on housing data because it was actually generally a good thing of what we saw here recently. So we got some housing data last Friday. And a couple things that we saw was housing starts and building permits. So housing starts came in right about 1.5 million, which was a huge increase from the prior month. I think almost maybe a little bit over even 15% increase from the prior month. So very big increase there on housing starts. And then we also saw building permits come in at just under 1.5 million. I think the number was 1.48 million there. We also got today we had initial jobless claims come out at 223,000. And then the biggest thing that I did want to cover for this past week of kind of lighter data with the holiday was leading market indicators. So before I jump into what we saw, I'll share just a brief summary of what this is meant to cover. So leading market indicators is meant to provide kind of an early indication of turning points in the business cycle. Don't take this as the answer, to be very clear. It's meant to tell us ultimately where the market and the economy could go short term, but just know that this is never a predictor. This does not actually mean that you should act on these indicators, but nonetheless, they are important to share. And so yesterday on Wednesday, we had leading market indicators come out, and it showed that we're down 0.1%. Now, it's important to note that this has actually declined throughout the entire year, well, over the year of 2024, I should say more specifically. Which obviously continued here from the recent number as well. But what I'll share is that these declines have been pretty minor. So certainly something to watch, but keep in mind, maybe to my point earlier, do not use this as a reference point for where the market especially is going to go, because we've seen these kind of slow declines throughout the year last year. And obviously the market had a phenomenal 2024. So important to share, but again, do not take this as a true indicator of what you should do in terms of your investment strategy. We'll obviously continue to keep an eye on this as we go from here, but if that remains to see some declines, and especially larger ones, that will be important to watch. Before we get to our question of the week, although this is all based around the same thing, I do want to highlight that next Wednesday we get the Fed decision on the rate cut, or rate decision, I should say more generally, and then the Fed press conference to follow. So be sure to tune in next Thursday at 3. We'll make sure we cover everything Fed related. But of course, I guess not to spend too much time on the Fed back to back, but a lot of people have the question of what should we expect in the Fed meeting. So we'll highlight that in our question of the week here this week, especially given that there's a lot of uncertainty about what could come and potentially a bit of a change in the path. So before I share some thoughts on this, I'll back up a little bit and just kind of refresh on where we've gone. So going all the way back to 2020, we've seen significant changes from the Fed in rate policy decisions. And so over, through kind of some of the inflation periods that we saw, obviously the Fed was raising rates pretty aggressively, maybe a little bit behind the curve on it, but nonetheless raising rates pretty aggressively. And then more recently, as they've shared that they feel like inflation had been under control, they actually started cutting rates. And that has been kind of the path for a good chunk of 2024. And the next meeting again comes up on Wednesday, or I should say the next decision comes up on Wednesday, which of course poses the question, well, what is the Fed likely to do there on Wednesday? Now, what I'll share is, to be very clear, I don't have the crystal ball here. Nobody does. But I think that as we've seen some data come in since the last decision, and maybe more specifically the minutes from the last Fed meeting, I would say that it's probably not likely that the Fed will cut rates here in this January decision. Now, that said, it's by a narrow margin. So I think it's fair to say that this could surprise and possibly we do see a Fed rate cut here next week. But my take would be that it's more unlikely than likely. Let's put it that way. Part of that is that in the Fed minutes from the prior meeting, there was a lot more people on the side of slowing down these rate cuts than originally expected, I guess. And so the Fed, keep in mind, the Fed meeting is not just Fed Chair Powell, it's the entire organization. And there was a lot of folks who were leaning towards the path of actually not cutting rates in the last meeting, and certainly are looking towards this year and maybe a slower rate cut path ahead, which when we look at the data between those meetings, what we've seen is really strong jobs numbers. And depending on where you look, but certainly some signs of increases in inflation. Now, some of the core numbers, not so much, but the headline numbers, absolutely. And so it just depends a little bit on which data you want to pick apart. But nonetheless, if you look at kind of the data we've seen since then, some of it might suggest that we might have more Fed members on board for pausing the rate cuts. In other words, next Wednesday, keeping rates where they stand. Now, again, we'll certainly wait and see, and we'll share kind of the actual the reality of what we hear next week. So be sure to tune in next Thursday for, kind of not just what the Fed decided, but also what we heard in the press conference. But in the meantime, hopefully that helps kind of give a glimpse of what we're watching in the week ahead. For those in the Pacific Northwest, enjoy this sunshine. I know it's cold, but it's definitely been some great winter days here out this way. So enjoy the sunshine over the upcoming weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday at 3.